Picture this, the most advanced species in the galaxy, representatives of 47 different civilizations, all gathered in one massive chamber aboard Station Harmony. Sounds impressive, right? Well, it would be, if they weren't all arguing about the proper way to argue about arguing. Ambassador Klaxon, a 6-foot-tall praying mantis with an MBA in bureaucratic excellence, tapped his gavel exactly 17 times. Why 17? Because the Procedural Manual of Interspecies Discourse, 3rd Revised Edition, clearly stated that 16 taps indicated mild concern while 18 suggested panic. 17 was the sweet spot for impending galactic catastrophe, but let's keep things civilized. The chair recognizes the distinguished representative from the Andromeda Collective, Klaxon announced, but his compound eyes reflecting the chamber's holographic displays showing asteroid trajectories aimed directly at populated worlds. Counselor Nebula, a being composed entirely of sentient gas who somehow managed to look perpetually thoughtful, began to speak. Before we address the crisis at hand, we must first contemplate the nature of crisis itself. Is not crisis merely opportunity dressed in the robes of urgency? And are we not, in our haste to act, risking the very essence of deliberative wisdom that separates civilization from chaos? Representative Grunt, a literal boulder with googly eyes stuck to his rocky surface, nodded slowly. Being made of granite gave him a unique perspective on taking things at face value. Nebula speaks truth. We must rock solid foundation before building solution house. 6 standard days. 6 entire days they'd been at this. While a rogue asteroid field the size of Luxembourg barreled toward 3 colony systems with a combined population of 42 million beings. The asteroids were moving at a predictable trajectory. They had the technology to deflect them. And the solution was so straightforward that even the station's maintenance AI had submitted a helpful 30-page report on implementation strategies. But first, they had to debate the proper cultural sensitivity protocols for emergency asteroid deflection. Apparently, the Zephyrian delegation considered rapid trajectory alterations to be spiritually offensive to space rocks, while the Crystalline Assembly insisted that any solution must account for the mineral rights of the asteroids themselves. Klaxon consulted his 3-inch thick manual. The chair notes that we have now reached the mandatory philosophical contemplation break as outlined in Section 847B of the Debate Continuance Protocols. All representatives will now engage in exactly 14 minutes of quiet reflection on the metaphysical implications of their positions. And so the galaxy's finest minds sat in silence contemplating the deeper meaning of not getting squashed by space rocks, while those very same space rocks continued their leisurely journey toward populated worlds. The irony would have been delicious if it weren't so potentially fatal. The massive doors to the council chamber hissed open, interrupting the contemplation break at minute 13. In walked a figure that immediately caused 47 different species to experience their respective versions of confused terror. Captain Jake Morrison, known to his engineering crew as Wrench, stood about 6 feet tall in coveralls that had seen better decades. His hair stuck up at angles that defied at least 3 laws of physics, and he carried a steaming mug of coffee that he'd somehow procured from the station's apparently still functioning cafeteria. "Sorry I'm late," Jake announced to the chamber, completely oblivious to the fact that he'd just violated Protocol 1247, the unauthorized interruption of formal proceedings. Had to fix your life support system. Amazing how you can debate the fate of the galaxy when you can't actually breathe, but hey, different priorities, right? Klaxon's antennae twitched with the bureaucratic equivalent of a stroke. "Excuse me, unidentified bipedal entity, but this is a closed session of the Galactic Council. Your presence here violates no fewer than 12 interspecies agreements, including the Treaty of Formal Introductions and the Accord on Proper Chamber Etiquette." Jake looked around the chamber, taking in the elaborate atmospheric zones, the floating translation matrices, and the fact that one representative appeared to be a sentient patch of electricity arguing with itself. "Right. Well, I'm Jake Morrison, Terra Engineering Corps. Got your distress signal about the asteroid problem." He took a sip of coffee and grimaced. Seriously, who programmed your replicators? This tastes like liquid despair mixed with floor cleaner. The human speaks without recognition, gasped Senator Flubnub, a purple jellyfish floating in a mobility tank. This is most irregular. We must convene the Committee on Unexpected Arrivals to address this breach of protocol. Before we can convene that committee, added Councillor Wispanuk, a being that looked like a cross between a peacock and a philosophy textbook, we must first establish a subcommittee to determine if the Committee on Unexpected Arrivals has jurisdiction over coffee-bearing bipedal intrusions. Jake stared at them. You want to form a committee to decide if you can form a committee to talk about me being here? Precisely. Claxon beamed, his compound eyes glittering with procedural joy. The human understands. This is most encouraging. While people are dying, Jake added flatly. The chamber fell silent. You could have heard a pin drop, if pins made noise in 47 different atmospheric compositions. Well, Nebula finally spoke. Death is but another transition in the great cosmic dance. Perhaps these asteroids are simply teaching us about the impermanence of existence. Jake sat down in the nearest chair, which happened to be reserved for the delegate of sacred seating arrangements, causing another minor diplomatic incident. Or maybe they're just big rocks that need to be moved before they squash a bunch of people. But what do I know? I just fix things for a living. What followed was Jake's introduction to the mind-bending bureaucracy that somehow passed for crisis management in the wider galaxy. He watched in growing amazement as the council managed to turn a straightforward engineering problem into a philosophical debate about the nature of existence, seasoned with a healthy dose of interdimensional red tape. I call to order the Emergency Subcommittee on Asteroid-Related Catastrophe Assessment, announced Claxon, pending approval from the Committee on Committee Formation, which is currently awaiting review from the Board of Procedural Oversight. Jake learned that Senator Blob, a shape-shifting entity from the flexible dimension, literally changed his mind every few minutes. One moment he was advocating for immediate action, the next he was arguing that asteroids had feelings too and deserved representation in any decision affecting their trajectory. But consider, Blob gurgled, his form shifting from a cube to something resembling a troubled sphere. If we move these asteroids, are we not engaging in cosmic bullying? What if they're simply trying to visit those planets for legitimate asteroid business? Meanwhile, the Hive Mind Collective was having an argument with itself that sounded like a philosophical debate being conducted by a room full of angry bees. We must act swiftly, buzzed one voice. No, we must deliberate carefully, buzzed another. Actually, we should table this until next quarter, buzzed a third. The previous speaker is an idiot, added a fourth voice, apparently forgetting they were all the same entity. Jake watched a heated hour-long debate about whether the emergency font should be Impact Bold or Times New Roman Heavy, while the holographic display showed the asteroids getting steadily closer to their targets. The font debate was immediately followed by a 40-minute discussion on whether the color red was too aggressive for emergency alerts, with several delegates arguing that crimson or scarlet might be more diplomatically appropriate. Point of order, called out Representative Zapp, a being of pure energy that communicated through controlled lightning strikes. Before we can finalize our emergency typography, shouldn't we first establish the proper formatting for interspecies distress documents? An excellent point, agreed Claxon. I hereby propose the formation of the Subcommittee on Emergency Aesthetic Consistency. Jake buried his face in his hands. The asteroids will hit those colonies in 18 hours. Plenty of time, chirped Councillor Tweedle, a bird-like being with a penchant for toxic optimism. Why, the great debate of 2847 lasted 6 months, and look how well that turned out. Everyone was very satisfied with the process, even if 3 star systems did collapse from economic uncertainty during the deliberations. That's when Jake discovered the Council's crown jewel of bureaucratic insanity, the Emergency Response Protocol. This masterpiece of administrative thinking required 72 hours advance notice to officially declare an emergency, followed by a mandatory cooling-off period to ensure that the emergency was, in fact, an emergency and not just a really urgent situation masquerading as an emergency. But the emergency is happening now, Jake pointed out. Ah, said Claxon, but is it really? Without proper documentation and committee review, how can we be certain this asteroid situation rises to the level of genuine emergency? What if it's merely a very serious concern? Or perhaps an elevated worry? We have entirely different protocols for each classification. Jake felt his sanity taking a vacation. As the debate raged on, Jake found himself taking notes on the sheer absurdity unfolding before him. His engineering mind, trained to identify problems and implement solutions, was having difficulty processing the elaborate maze of inefficiency that passed for decision-making among the galaxy's supposedly most advanced civilizations. In his 20-year career with Terra Engineering, Jake had fixed everything from broken fusion reactors to malfunctioning space elevators, usually under time pressure that made this asteroid situation look like a leisurely stroll through the park. The human approach was refreshingly simple: identify the problem, determine the solution, implement the fix, and move on to the next crisis. Apparently, the rest of the galaxy had missed that particular memo. "Let me get this straight," Jake said during a brief recess in the debates. "You have 3 different alien civilizations that have already solved identical asteroid problems. The Quantum Collective has gravitational deflection arrays, the Stellar Engineers have mass drivers, and the Temporal Mechanics Guild has reality adjustment protocols that could move those rocks without anyone even noticing. But their solutions are all stuck in legal review?" "Oh yes," nodded bureaucrat Prime Zingle, a robot designed specifically for administrative tasks. "The Quantum Collective's solution is under review by the Department of Gravitational Ethics. The Stellar Engineers are awaiting approval from the Committee on Mass Driver Safety Standards. And the Temporal Mechanics Guild's proposal is being evaluated by the Bureau of Reality Alteration Permits. Standard procedure." Jake stared at the holographic display showing the asteroid field's updated position. 36 hours until impact. How long do these reviews usually take? "Oh, anywhere from 6 months to several decades. We want to be thorough." Meanwhile, the death toll from the approaching asteroids was climbing as evacuation efforts struggled with their own bureaucratic nightmares. Each species had different evacuation protocols, different definitions of civilian, and different opinions on whether evacuation was actually necessary or just an overreaction to a natural cosmic phenomenon. Jake watched Counselor Glibber, a sentient puddle of silver liquid, argue passionately that the asteroids might be trying to communicate and destroying them would constitute xenocide against a potentially undiscovered rock-based intelligence. This led to a 2-hour debate about the rights of inanimate objects and whether minerals could be considered a protected class under galactic equality legislation. "In my professional opinion as a certified rock whisperer," declared Dr. Pebbles, a geologist from the crystal dimension, "these asteroids show clear signs of having feelings. Notice the way they're moving in formation? That's definitely emotional expression. They're probably just lonely and looking for friends." The hive mind collective immediately split into 17 different factions over this revelation, each arguing a different interpretation of asteroid psychology. Jake contemplated the irony that a species capable of faster-than-light travel was seriously debating the emotional needs of space rocks, while 42 million beings faced imminent death. By hour 7 of day 6, Jake had filled 3 notebooks with observations about alien logic, including gems like, "Why does the Emergency Response Committee need a committee to study the committee and who decided that a crisis committee requires 72 hours notice to exist?" His personal favorite was the discovery that the Council had a Department of Departmental Oversight, whose primary function was to oversee the department that oversaw other departments. The head of this department was currently in a meeting with himself to determine whether he had the authority to make decisions about his own authority. Somebody, Jake realized, had to cut through this madness before the galaxy's most elaborate funeral became a reality. Jake stood up in the middle of Ambassador Claxon's passionate speech about the importance of following proper asteroid deflection paperwork procedures. The move caused a ripple of shocked gasps throughout the chamber, as interrupting a formal presentation violated approximately 14 different protocols. "I need 5 minutes," Jake announced. The chamber fell silent. Claxon's antennae quivered with indignation. The human entity cannot simply demand speaking time without first submitting a request for temporal allocation Form 2247C, which must then be reviewed by the Committee on Speaking Order, pending approval from. "People are going to die in 31 hours, Jake interrupted. "I need 5 minutes to save them." What followed was perhaps the most surreal 20 minutes of Jake's life, as the council engaged in an elaborate debate about whether to give him 5 minutes. They discussed the precedent it would set, the proper protocols for emergency speaking requests, and whether 5 minutes was too long or too short for adequate problem solving. Senator Blob shifted into what appeared to be a thinking pose. "But if we give the human 5 minutes, what's to stop other species from demanding time limits for their presentations? The Zephyrians might want 7 minutes, the Crystal Assembly could ask for 3.5 minutes. And don't even get me started on the temporal engineers who experience time differently than the rest of us." Finally, after a formal vote that required 2 recounts and a consultation with the Department of Democratic Procedures, Jake was granted exactly 5 minutes to speak. A holographic timer appeared above his head, counting down. "Right," Jake began. "Here's your solution. The quantum collective has gravity deflectors. The stellar engineers have mass drivers. The temporal mechanics guild has reality adjusters. You take the gravity deflectors, point them at the asteroids to slow them down. You use the mass drivers to change their trajectory. Then you use the reality adjusters to clean up any variables you missed. Problem solved in about 6 hours of actual work. 4 minutes and 37 seconds remaining." But the legal reviews started Claxon. "Skip them. Emergency powers. You vote right now to temporarily suspend bureaucratic review for clear and present dangers to populated worlds. You can argue about the paperwork after people stop dying." 3 minutes and 42 seconds. The cultural sensitivity assessments tried Nebula. "The asteroids don't have a culture. They're rocks. Big, dangerous rocks that are about to kill 42 million people. Your cultural sensitivity should be toward the people who want to keep breathing." 2 minutes and 55 seconds. The proper committee formations attempted bureaucrat Prime Zingle. "Form 1 committee, the Make It Happen Committee. Give it unlimited authority to implement this solution immediately. Membership: anyone who actually wants to solve the problem instead of talking about solving the problem." 1 minute and 48 seconds. The interdimensional permits. Permit this. Jake held up his middle finger, a gesture that somehow translated universally across all 47 species as a sign of extreme exasperation. "You have all the technology you need. You have all the knowledge you need. You have all the resources you need. The only thing you're missing is the decision to actually do something." 37 seconds remaining. Every minute you spend debating this, more evacuation ships fail to launch because they're waiting for departure permits. More families get separated because they can't figure out which species-specific evacuation protocol applies to mixed households. More people die because you're treating a simple engineering problem like a philosophical debate. 10 seconds. Make a decision. Now. The timer hit 0. The chamber erupted in chaos as 47 different species all tried to process the revolutionary concept of direct action. Jake sat down in his unauthorized chair and waited for the galaxy's collective brain to catch up with the obvious. It took another 2 hours, but eventually they voted. The emergency action authorization passed by a margin of 46-1, with only the representative from the Department of Proper Procedures voting against it on the grounds that the vote itself hadn't been properly scheduled. Within 6 hours, the combined technologies of 3 different civilizations had safely deflected the asteroid field, using exactly the solution Jake had outlined. 42 million beings went to sleep that night in their own beds instead of becoming cosmic debris. Not a single piece of paperwork was filed until after the job was done. 3 weeks later, Jake found himself sitting in what the council generously called his new office. It was a supply closet. A very nice supply closet, mind you, with excellent lighting and a coffee machine that actually produced something resembling coffee instead of liquid existential dread, but still fundamentally a closet. The nameplate on his door read, Director of Actually Getting Things Done, a position the council had to create because apparently no one had thought to have such a role before. His job description was refreshingly simple. When there's a crisis, Jake fixes it. Everyone else gets out of his way. The best part. His authority superseded approximately 400 different committees, 17 departments, and 6 interdimensional regulatory bodies. The council had learned that sometimes the most sophisticated solution was to let the person who knew how to solve the problem actually solve it. Ambassador Claxon had adapted to the new paradigm with surprising grace. He still loved his procedures and protocols, but now he used them to streamline rather than complicate. It's remarkable, he told Jake during one of their weekly efficiency meetings. When you remove the bureaucracy from emergency response, emergencies get responded to much more efficiently. Who would have thought? Senator Blob had stabilized into a permanent problem-solving shape and was now head of the newly formed Department of Common Sense, while the Hive Mind Collective had finally agreed with itself that arguing with yourself was counterproductive when lives were at stake. Even Counselor Nebula had embraced the concept of practical philosophy. I have come to understand, she announced in her naturally mystical way, that sometimes the deepest wisdom lies not in contemplating action, but in taking it. Jake's approach had become known throughout the galaxy as the Morrison method, though he personally preferred to call it just fix the damn thing. 3 interstellar conflicts had been resolved using his technique of cutting through diplomatic nonsense to address the actual underlying problems. 2 trade disputes had been settled by asking the simple question, what do you actually want, and how can we make that happen without everyone dying? The council was currently forming a committee to study why Jake's approach worked so well, which Jake found hilariously ironic. He'd submitted a 1-page report that summarized his methodology: identify problem, implement solution. Skip the meetings. The committee was expected to spend 6 months analyzing this revolutionary concept. His coffee machine gurgled to life, producing another cup of almost coffee. Jake leaned back in his chair, a genuine ergonomic office chair, his one demand during salary negotiations, and reviewed the day's crisis reports. Nothing major. Just a minor space plague that needed containing, a rogue artificial intelligence that needed counseling, and a diplomatic incident involving 2 species who were at war because of a mistranslation in a treaty from 300 years ago. All in a day's work for the galaxy's first director of actually getting things done. Jake took a sip of his coffee and smiled. It still tasted terrible, but at least now, when the galaxy had a crisis, someone would actually do something about it instead of forming a committee to study the feasibility of considering the possibility of maybe taking action at some point in the future. Sometimes the best solution wasn't the most complicated one. Sometimes it was just the one that actually worked.